Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleased to say we're now moving into the next stage of the discussions, and it's really my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chandra, Shah and Sue Webb. It's a pretty interesting discussion, this. So in terms of Dr. Chandra Shah, he's done some pretty interesting work in this space, and Bernard, I'm glad you're in the room for this, for forecasting labour supply and occupational demand, and he's done a fair bit of work, particularly in Victoria. As you know, the vocational education and training sector's headed down this contestable path, and governments like to pick winners, so that work is certainly pretty compelling. Now, Professor Sue Webb also has a very intriguing background, and her field of research is in policy, sociology and understanding, a pretty important element, policy effects in higher education and lifelong learning, with a key focus on social inclusion. Until 3 years ago, she was at the University of Sheffield in the UK, but I'm pleased to say since coming to Australia, she's continued this important work. In terms of the discussion today, it's about what matters in understanding the post-school destinations of young Australians, and the research identifies the factors that influence those post-school choices. But I will not steal their thunder. Dr. Chandra will kick off the presentation, so please welcome Dr. Chandra.
I always wanted to be able to play music, and given my limited talents, I thought I would realize this aspiration in my second life or afterlife. But listening to Jonathan today, I think I might have to revise the timetable and maybe think about learning music earlier than afterlife. I think you've been a very good inspiration, and I think we need more people like you to shape the aspiration of younger people, because as this research shows, aspiration developed at an early age has a strong effect in outcomes later in life. Okay, back to our talk. The first key to designing effective policies for reducing inequalities and improving social inclusion is to have good understanding of the socioeconomic factors that drive educational outcomes for young people, including the pathways through which these factors operate. This research investigates the effects of the individual, parental, school, and neighbourhood factors that affect post-school destinations of young Australians. Unlike other studies, which tend to control either for school effects or neighbourhood effects, we are controlling for both neighbourhood and school effects in the same model. The overall evidence suggests that children brought up in more economically disadvantaged neighbourhoods have poorer schooling and post-school outcomes. This result is important because initial education and training differentials are key factors in understanding lifetime income inequalities and the extent of intergenerational socioeconomic mobility. When social disadvantage becomes entrenched in a neighbourhood, the restorative potential of services such as health and education can diminish and costs escalate. So what are the ways through which neighbourhoods affect outcomes? A number of key pathways have been identified through which neighbourhoods factors might have an impact on educational outcomes. First, more affluent neighbourhoods typically have better schools, which in turn aid achievement of better educational outcomes for students living in those neighbourhoods. Second, children are influenced by their peers, but not only their peers, they're also influenced by the attitudes of adults other than the parents in their neighborhoods. The third factor through which neighborhood effects are important for outcomes is through the presence or absence of education-related amenities such as libraries and the general culture of learning in the neighborhood. Just show you this photo, and the photo clearly shows two distinct neighborhoods. The allocation of people to these neighborhoods is not random. Families select to live in a particular neighborhood depending on their income and wealth. And clearly you can tell the selection of wealthier people would be on the right-hand side, and people who do not have wealth would be on the left-hand side. As a result, a strong correlation in educational outcomes for young people living in the same neighborhood may be observed. And an added complication is that allocation of children might not be to the local school. Children may be selected on the basis of the ability into selective schools which may be in a completely different neighborhood. Selection of children into private schools, which are often located in wealthier neighborhoods, is on the basis of the parents' ability to pay school fees. Because of these selection issues, to empirically distinguish between alternative explanations of student outcomes can be difficult. In some instances, these sort of selection processes has a potential to overestimate the importance of neighborhood characteristics in predicting student outcomes. To investigate this issue of neighborhood factors affecting student outcomes, we used the LSAT data, and we linked the LSAT data with data from the 2006 census. These data were linked at the postcode level. We investigated 4 different neighborhood factors, and these are derived from 20 different census variables. The first one measures the socioeconomic status of the neighborhood. The second, the residential stability of the neighborhood. The third one, the household type. So there were old neighborhoods with old established houses and households compared to those which were in newly established suburbs with new housing and younger people generally. And the fourth one was the ethnic diversity of the neighborhood. We investigated 3 outcomes at 3 different ages for young people. The first one was at age 15, and this looked at 4 different development stages of a child, whether they had achieved certain level of numeracy, literacy, and other things at age 15, their attitudes towards schooling, whether neighborhood factors affected these is what we investigate. Importantly, we also have a measure for the aspiration at age 15. The second set of outcomes were those measured at age 17, and they looked at whether the young person was engaged in education and training or not. And the third one was at age 19, and it looked at whether the young person was in a university course or not, or either in university, vocational education, training, or not engaged in any education and training. The first set of results relate to the outcomes at age 15, and these outcomes show that the neighborhood factors are quite important in explaining things like achievement and aspiration of young people. In this model, we controlled for individual and family characteristics. So these are quite strong results. And for ease of interpretation, we have color-coded the tables. The lighter color shows weaker effects, and the stronger color shows stronger effects. To this model, then we introduce school fixed effects. And what we find when we do that is that none of the neighborhood factors are significant anymore. The school fixed effects we were able to introduce because we knew the school that the student went to. So we were able to control for each individual school. These school fixed effects allow for the identification of neighborhood effects from differences in outcomes between students at the same school, but who may live in different neighborhoods. They capture all the differences observed and unobserved in the characteristics of schools, which include things like teaching quality, school leadership, financial and other resources, the cultural background of the school, the quality of the student intake, etc. But because the neighborhood of school, because the characteristics of neighborhoods where students live are generally mirrored in the composition of schools, these are also captured in the school fixed effects. And that's what we are noticing in the results. Unfortunately, the school fixed effects do not tell us what specific school factors make a difference. But we know things such as teacher quality, school leadership are important and do make a difference. And these are related quite clearly to school resourcing. Just a quick look at some of the individual and family effects which were independently significant in the model. A lot of these people already know about. And the factors are grouped. The first set is about the individual. The second set of factors is about the composition of the family, whether the child is the youngest child, only child, or living in a two-parent family. The next one is about the ethnicity of the family. Next one is about the SES, or socioeconomic status of the parents. And the last one is about the home environment. And you can see clearly, first of all, I won't go through all the results because too many. The home environment is very strongly positively related to those outcomes. Having books at home is very significant in shaping the aspiration of students to attend university courses. It's important in terms of their achievement, attitude, and application as well. One other thing that I just might mention is the strong effect of a student having at least one parent who was born in Asia. And I was listening to a program on Saturday on Radio National, and they were interviewing a journalist based in Shanghai. He was talking about the cramming schools in Shanghai and how competitive it is for students there. Parents sending students to tutoring schools before and after school to get a competitive advantage. And I'm just wondering, there is anecdotal evidence that there are those cramming and tutoring schools in Australia as well. And I'm just wondering whether this result about Asian descent to a certain extent reflects that sort of behavior in Australia as well. I won't go into outcomes at age 17, go straight into outcomes at age 19. And what we did to investigate the outcomes at age 19, and just concentrating on the university outcome, we sequentially fitted increasingly complex models to the data. The first one included only neighborhood factors. Then we added in the individual and family effects, and then the school fixed effects, and then the final model included outcomes which were observed at age 15, which were aspiration, attitude, application, and achievement. And you can see that once we bring in the school fixed effects and the outcomes at age 15, the neighborhood factors all disappear. Some specific results, and most of these are probably already known, that if you are relative to a female, a male has significantly negative effect. A person who is male, their results are significantly negative in terms of university outcome. Born in Australia has a positive effect. Asian descent, once again, has a very strong effect on university outcome. These are the outcomes that were measured at age 15. And we're trying to explain the outcomes at age 19 based on what we observed about this young person at age 15. And you can see very clearly that aspirations developed at an early age has an impact later on in the schooling outcomes. So just a few concluding comments. Individual and family characteristics are important determinants of educational outcomes for young people, which is not anything very new. But living in low SES neighborhoods has a negative impact on outcomes, which disappears when we control for the school that the child attends. So what this means is that two similar students attending the same school but living in neighborhoods with different SES or socioeconomic status are likely to have similar outcomes. So how do we, can we reduce disparities? Well, we can reduce disparities in outcomes between students, and this is hypothetical because it's not derived from the results, but they can be reduced by different allocation of teachers, students, and resources across schools. We do know that a lot of the good teachers are concentrated in schools which are located in wealthier suburbs or private schools. So if you can do some reallocation of good teachers into schools where they can make a bigger impact, then we may be able to reduce some of the disparities. And the final thing relates to what Jonathan talked about today, and which is how do we develop and shape the aspiration of young people at an early age, because it seems to have an effect later on in life. The second part of this research, we use qualitative methods to investigate the mechanisms that enable people in low SES neighborhoods to overcome the neighborhood effects and participate in post-school education and training. It explores the specific schooling and neighborhood factors that make a difference for some people. These things cannot be explored with the statistical data that we have, and therefore we're using qualitative methods to do this. And Webb will report on that part of the research now.
Thanks, Chandra. As Chandra says there, the issues that were raised by that quantitative research also raised further issues which were perhaps explored in some ways through qualitative work. Really, in a sense, the kind of things that we were hearing from Jonathan, trying to understand what were the kind of experiences behind those examples of living in different kinds of neighbourhoods and then attending a school where the outcomes were actually more the effect of the school as opposed to the neighbourhoods in which one was living. What were those kinds of particular moments, particular kind of networks, particular communities, particular kind of contacts that one had that actually enabled one to continue in education and training post-school and to have aspirations to go on to university. So these are the kinds of issues that we picked up in the second part of the work. And it started off with these ideas. For school effects, whilst the first part of the research identified school effects, if, as Chandra says, good schools are often in good neighbourhoods, how do you easily measure and separate out some of those characteristics within the school and outside the school that are impacting on those school effects? The quantitative data can give you information about the average case, but what about the spread of the cases? Some people in low socioeconomic status neighbourhoods do participate in education and training after school. How does that happen? What's going on there? Is it just that they've gone out of their area to study in a particular school where the expectation of that school is that you stay on after the age of year 10 or year 11 or year 12? So the purpose of the qualitative research was to try and explore what in the research literature is called the sources of effects heterogeneity. A bit of a mouthful, but it's trying to make sense of how is it that some people buck trends? What is it that's enabling some people to kind of move in ways that are different from others in their neighbourhoods? So our research problem, it's about this geographical and social imbalance in higher education participation. We all know this. How do we try and redress this? We also know things about particular areas, particular neighbourhoods from other kinds of research. There's been kind of quite a number of policy studies and research done on distance from metropolitan centres, how distance can affect participation. Communities can be remote. When you're far removed from certain types of educational provision, perhaps in regional areas outside of metropolitan cities, the provision may be different. The provision may be more limited. There may not be so much choice. There's costs of travelling to and from the different places for work, for education, and so on. We know in many areas, in urban fringe areas, regional and rural areas, where participation in higher education is much lower than in the metropolitan areas, that young people tend to enter work after school or enter the vet and TAFE pathway more than go on to university education. But we know that females are slightly different, that they're more likely to study than go directly into work, but the study may well be part-time. We know, of course, as well that the kind of work that people are studying for is very often in human service work. It's working in aged care or childcare or other aspects of human service work. So what are we interested in trying to ask in this research? As I say, we were interested in this mouthful of the sources of effects heterogeneity. We asked these two particular questions about the specific mechanisms through which the characteristics of neighbourhoods might affect an individual. and we asked, how do individuals live their lives in these neighbourhoods of disadvantage? How do they make decisions about where, how, with whom they spend their time, and imagine their education and work futures? The reason for this was because of a theoretical frame in which we wanted to avoid deficit thinking about particular kinds of neighbourhoods. We were drawn to this particular quote from the work of John Smythe and McInerney about the effects of neighbourhoods and places on the lives, educational opportunities and life chances of young people from contexts of social economic disadvantage. And the idea that that's often not well understood and invariably reinforces deficit stereotypes. So how do we look at this in non-deficit ways? Well, I think Jonathan Welch's examples really show that there are lots of things to give us lots of hope, that in situations of difficulty dealing with through his school of hard knocks, that people actually can experience positive things and there can be hope. But that's through looking at how people are living their lives. So we're drawn to what we regard as a social cultural way of thinking about the problem, and to research that tries to understand people's everyday life worlds. What we did was we focused in on qualitative study in 4 areas. We used the description and categorization of areas from the quantitative study. We identified from that quantitative study areas of socioeconomic status that would be identified as having social disadvantage. We deliberately honed in on areas outside of metropolitan areas because of the participation rate there being much lower than in metropolitan areas. We took 2 areas that we regard as being on the urban fringe, and we took 2 areas that were in regional and rural areas outside of metropolitan areas. 2 of these areas on the urban fringe were in South Australia. We call them North Town and Southland. 2 were in Victoria, the regional area of West Vale and East Shire. These are our pseudonyms. In this study, we focused in on a number of levels. In trying to understand how people lived their lives, we wanted to understand something about the context in which they were living their lives. So we did look at policies, we looked at practices of organisations that would be in contact with young people. We interviewed 53 key stakeholders across these 2 states, and we conducted focus groups with young people referred to us through those stakeholders, because we were deliberately trying to understand how is it that people can participate. So we were looking at those people, young people, who were in contact with education and training, either in the last couple of years of their schooling, in the vet system, or in the university system, or about to go into the university system. From those 51 young people, we identified different patterns of participation and different experiences in their lives. And we followed up 16 individual case studies that we talked to young people in a lot more depth. Just briefly, to give you a sense of the kinds of spaces. North Town and Southland. Urban fringe, but for me, coming from the UK, it didn't look very urban fringe to me. In fact, of course, you will all know, those Brits, we just think the beach is just the place to be. The sense that this urban fringe area, at least in Southland, is backed by that beautiful beach view. But of course, the foreground is the pawnbroker. Large developments in the top right picture show shopping centres, show housing, but it's purpose-built for particular purposes, for particular manufacturing set in a particular economic time, which is now facing major industrial restructuring and dislocation. So places experiencing major economic difficulties. In East Shire and West Vale, similarly, no sign of masses of urban sprawl and development as I would understand it from a UK context. But nevertheless, you have the contrast of the sense of space, sense of nature, but also of industrial despolation. So what were we focusing on? We were focusing on understanding aspiration. Aspiration and why? Why aspiration? Because the capacity to aspire is a navigational capacity. The more privileged in any society simply have used the map of its norms to explore the future more frequently and more realistically, to share this knowledge with one another and more routinely than their poorer and weaker neighbours. The poorer members, precisely because of their lack of opportunities to practice the use of this navigational capacity, have a more brittle horizon of aspirations. So says Apajuri. Aspirations, as a number of NCVER reports have published in the last couple of weeks have identified, are the key to understanding how it is that people continue on in education and training, and particularly consider higher education. But much of the quantitative research that's been done can find the correlations between aspirations and continuing participation. But what they point to is we still don't quite know how do those aspirations develop, and how is it that people develop these navigational experiences and practices so they can work their way through difficult times. Well, we looked at what people did. Now, not surprisingly, because of, in a sense, the purposive nature of our sample, post-school pathways used the vocational education and training to a large extent. The majority of the people who were engaged in learning in these low socioeconomic status areas were following a vocational education and training pathway. They were following pathways that were local, and I think that was the important thing. So it wasn't so much just that it was vocational education and training. Whatever that pathway was, it was a local pathway. There were people who were using vocational education and training in dual sector institutions or institutions that had partnerships with universities. We noticed and we had examples of the protracted nature of that route that people were taking. The more costly, in some ways, people often found themselves actually having to pay for parts of that pathway that if only they had been able to have directly entered the university sector would have actually been quicker and cost them less. They often had lower ATAR scores. They had been to schools that had on average ATAR scores that would not have given them access to Geo8 universities. So they were using these pathways, but these pathways were almost setting and limiting where they might be able to go, regardless of what their aspirations might be. There were pathways to particular types of professions, professions very much associated with human services, education, in some cases the arts, but very much kind of more the lower end of the professional rankings, not the old traditional professions. So why? Well, when we started to look at why, why local? A lot of this was to do with very good things. And I was reminded when somebody told me when I was going out to do this work in parts of Victoria, I was at a conference and somebody was explaining to me some of the areas in Australia, and as I was still relatively new to that. And it did remind me, I'm afraid, of the film title, The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. But we did have that sense of the good. We had lots of stories about the good. But the good held people locally. The good was about this being a place where, okay, it's a hole. It's literally, if you look at the landscape, it's right at the bottom. There are mountains around us. But it's a great place to live. And this quote from Simone goes on to further talk about you can go anywhere and you'll probably know someone. that sort of thing's encouraging. That's why I reckon a few people do stay here and don't move away, because they've family here, they've friends, they have a network of people. They know there's people they can rely on. So the good is good, but the good is also a community that keeps you there. It's part of how you navigate, and your navigational knowledge of how to go beyond it is very limited. It's a place to be. The nature is something to aspire to. There's beaches, there's rivers, depending on what your hobbies are. There's much you can do here. Even businesses. One of the local council officers involved in economic development said this is one of the things that drives businesses, or rather doesn't drive businesses, because people actually just want to locate their business and stay and make their business work in the local area, rather than do what the person regarded as being a full-blown investment attraction plan. But these can also lead to barriers. Travel, distance, physical barriers, but also social barriers, social imaginaries, how one imagines one's future. And this quote from a staff member from one of the regional universities, that people haven't the self-confidence, they're majorly inhibited. It's a big barrier for them. The idea of I've got to live away from home. It's too scary. And then there's, well, how do you move out when people think that you come from the ugly, when people think there's a stigma to where you're from? And people, the students that we talked to, talk about the way in which they're stigmatized because of where they live. Employers think, well, do we want you because of where you live? And so in feeling these kinds of things, it makes it very difficult for people to navigate in a fully open kind of way. Then we found gender. Gender, if we're talking about aspiration, we're talking about family, we're talking about the role of parents, all of these things will seem to be very important. And yes, family traditions. Family traditions played out in very gendered ways. Boys very much focused on what their fathers did. My brother's a qualified builder, that seemed to be the thing. It's what my dad does. For girls, apprenticeships were much more limited. And for some girls, like this girl Jessica, recognizing that the apprenticeships would take her into the kinds of areas of work where the financial independence would be very limited. Because if you just go to TAFE, as she says, and do beauty, the income wasn't as high. For her, she started to think beyond that. But how? How do these aspirations, how do these new imaginaries develop? Well, very much, I think, as we've heard from Jonathan, school is an important influence. For Simone, particular teachers were absolutely vital. The way that they dealt with what she regarded as the rowdy, sporty ones who didn't give a crap about school, and enabled and supported her in her potential to do well at school. But it wasn't always school. We talked to people about their home backgrounds. There was lots of evidence of attitudes of families, of parents, stability, home life, books, travel, having a passport, all of those kinds of things. But people's own experiences with other peers, sports clubs, and were incredibly influential. People talked a lot about community activities, where they got to know about things that they didn't know from people in their immediate area. So something like a soccer club gets people out into other environments. But for some who did leave school without still knowing where they were going to go and went to work in the local shop, someone like Jessica, work experience was the way in which she learned to develop new learning capabilities and started to realize that there was something else out there and that she had the ability to do something different with her life. So our conclusions. Geography and place do affect these social imaginaries. They do hold people locally. Parents, families, and peers are major influences. They also do influence in very gendered ways. Often it's the girls who leave, because for girls there are actually fewer opportunities. But the poor transport, the poor physical infrastructure makes it very difficult for people to leave. Schools, though, and the support of schools are critical, but they can also restrict, because schools, even the good schools, were struggling to raise their ATAR levels. So, of course, the opportunities that schools can give students access to are equally limited. But it's not just about ATAR scores, it's about imaginaries of where to go, how far to travel, to go to that place that actually might mean physically relocating. So aspirations and new imaginaries, they do arise from a whole multiplicity of factors. And in order to think about the policy implications, there needs to be a lot more joined up thinking between the schooling parts of the system, the parts of the system that deal with the infrastructure in different areas, that deal with the different funding policies for transport, finding absurdities so that the funding to travel to school stops as soon as you leave school and try to study and go to a TAFE college. And then you actually physically can't afford to go there any longer. But yet there are buses going to those places because they're doing other things that the local authority is providing. And we had people working in transport saying, why can't we join these things up? Some of the fee structures between vet and university were also working particularly to the disadvantage of these sorts of students. These sorts of students who were taking certificates whilst at school when working because they needed to fund their way through schooling. Then when they take the long, slow route through vet into university study, they find they've already gained a Cert 3, which is part of the diploma. So they have to fund that part of their study for the diploma. But they have to take that if they want to aspire to go on to the degree level part of the study. So they're doubly hit. So joining up with other kinds of agencies, informal agencies, the kinds of things that we've been hearing about through music, but very much sports and hobby clubs, parent groups, other activities that the voluntary sector provide. Certainly we came away from this research thinking there are aspirations that can be tapped into, but people are often very much hindered by the certain aspects of the physical environment and the need to join some of these things up and the need to recognise where different kind of aspirations can take place. And they take place in sometimes the most surprising places. So thank you.
Thank you, Sue, and before that, Chandra. There's no question at the start of the day I said we wanted to look at some of the so what questions, and this type of research really helps our understanding of the real impact of disadvantage and the real important roles both joined up government can play and, of course, engagement with parents. So now I'm pleased to say that you get to eat. So morning tea is being served out in the foyer. Have a look at the next sessions as well, because it's another range of concurrent sessions, and we will be kicking off again at 11:30. So thank you.